Katy Hessel in conversation with Alex von Tunzelman. Curator Katy Hessel is pioneering a corrective to dismantle the long reign of men in the art scene. The story of art without men, in conjunction with her blog titled The Great Women Artists, revives the legacy of women artists from 1500 to the 21st century, encapsulating focal points in art history from dadaism to civil rights and anti-racism. In conversation with Alex Tunzelman, Hessel discusses the historical documentation of art and her attempts at dismantling patriarchy within the art world. Our first speaker for today, Katy Hessel, is an art historian, broadcaster, and curator dedicated to celebrating women artists from all over the world. She is the founder of The Great Women Artists, an Instagram account with almost 3 lakh followers. Her recent book is The Story of Art Without Men. The moderator for today is Alex von Tunzelman. She's a historian, screenwriter, and broadcaster. Her first book, Indian Summer, The Secret History of the End of an Empire, was an international bestseller, and her latest book, Fallen Idols, 12 Statues That Made History, was shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of art without men, Katy Hessel in conversation with Alex von Tunzelman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Now, if any of you were at my session with David Olusoga 4,000 years ago on Friday, we were talking about statues, a particular part of art, but perhaps also an expression of power. And they were all about men. The only woman mentioned is Queen Victoria, who, let's be honest, didn't exactly get there on merit. So we were talking all about men. So how delicious, how delightful to be here with the brilliant Katy Hessel talking about art without men. So Katy, how did you get the idea to start thinking about art without men? What kicked this off?
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all so much for coming. So 7 years ago, I had just finished my BA in art history, and something was on my mind that I felt like something was missing from art history. And in October 2015, I walked into an art fair, looked at thousands of artworks in front of me, and realized not a single one was by a woman. And then I said to myself, but could I even name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Could I name 10 pre-1850, any pre-1750? The answer was no. Had I essentially been looking at the history of art from a male perspective, essentially the history of patriarchy, the answer was yes. And so that night, I did what sort of any 21-year-old millennial would do, as I looked up the words women artists on Instagram, and nothing appeared. And so I literally couldn't sleep. And I had this epiphany, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna start an Instagram account, because I always think, use whatever resource you have in front of you. You know, it doesn't matter how much, how little or much money you have, use what you have in front of you. So I started a blog called The Great Women Artists, very much paying homage to an amazing art historian in the 70s called Linda Nochlin, who in 1971, at the dawn of the feminist movement, wrote the essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which really kick-started this debate. And so 50 years on, it seemed that not much has changed, so I wanted to do something about it. And then, I still update the blog on a daily basis. It's really a way for me to sort of use my knowledge to good use and challenge myself, find a different one every day. And then I started a podcast called The Great Women Artists Podcast, and now this book, which is The Story of Art Without Men.
Yes, you can just, if you look close up, it does say without men under the story of art, but almost disappearing. Goodbye, men. But Katy, give us some context for sort of what is the underrepresentation of women in art? Is there a way you can kind of quantify that for us?
Absolutely. So the reason why this book, if you look closely, it says without men. It's based on a very famous book in England called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich, who was a fantastic scholar who wrote this incredible book called The Story of Art. And the first edition in 1950 was wonderful, but it had one very significant flaw. He didn't mention a single woman artist. Even the 16th edition, which came out in the 2000s, includes just one. So I thought something has to be done. And this is the introductory Bible to art history. If you're a teenager in England, you get this Bible. And how can you possibly look at the history of art from one perspective? We need to break down the canon. But also, we have to question, what are we even seeing in our museums? So London's National Gallery, for example, the heart of the nation, where we go to learn about history and those who came before us. If I tell you the statistic, you will be absolutely shocked. So just 1% of their collection is made up of art by women artists, which is absolutely shocking. Similarly, the Royal Academy in London, a fantastic, prestigious, world-renowned museum. In 2023, they are yet to have a solo exhibition in their 250-year history in their main space by a woman artist. I mean, it's absolutely shocking.
Zero, literally zero women.
Zero
in
women so far.
250 years.
Exactly,
Wow.
exactly. So
Well, the
there
next
is so much to be
250
done.
years, we should only have women.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So, but also, I mean, this also acts as almost a microcosm for how we place monetary value on genders in society as well, considering that the highest earning woman artist living today, her work has just gone for 10% of the highest earning male artist. So to sort of give you those statistics, so much needs to be done.
Absolutely, and it is, I mean, very much in your book, women artists are certainly disadvantaged, but this is absolutely also a story globally. It's also a story about women of colour are even more disadvantaged, queer women, all sorts of women artists are really written out of this story, and we're certainly going to come to talk about some Indian artists later on. I think it's highly relevant in this context. But Katy, what's going on here? Okay, because now if you go back to John Ruskin, very famous art critic in the 19th century, he just said, well, no women can paint. So is this the thing? Are women just rubbish at art?
No! And actually, as recently as 2013, a very famous German expressionist called George Baselitz also said that women can't paint. So come on, guys, we need to support the women. I mean, we have to also, I was so fed up of reading about women artists in the context of men. If we mention Dora Maar, the fantastic surrealist, why would we go to her retrospective at Tate Modern? Are there 2 rooms dedicated to Picasso, who she dated for about a decade? Where is she in his exhibitions? And so what I wanted to do is really root women in their social and political context, in the time in which we lived, which also gives voice to women and also questions people's barbaric statements like Ruskin. The reason why he probably said women can't paint is because he didn't think also about the context in which they were working. So, for example, when we think of going to the National Gallery, we think of these sort of grand, multi-figured, beautiful paintings of mythological and biblical scenes, visceral paintings. The only way that an artist could even, first of all, paint something like that was if they had anatomical accuracy, if they could study the nude from life, if they knew the human body. Women weren't admitted to the life room until the 1890s, and still women around the world are still hindered on so much education. I mean, there is just so much to be done. And so the thing is, when we are comparing, a woman artist from the Baroque and a male artist from the Baroque, the thing is that, of course, if we're looking at skill, a man might be more skillful in the traditional sense. But you have to think, these women overcame every single boundary just to have their names immortalized in art history. The odds were completely against them, especially in the 19th century, where Rousseau, made it popular for women to be in the home and therefore not professional artists. And, it's ridiculous.
Absolutely, and I think something that's so important and interesting you do in the book as well is challenging that canon, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of medium. In terms of, we've been talking about painting, but there are many other forms of art and women's art.
Exactly, and when I read something like Gombrich's Story of Art, it really focuses on the high art, painting, sculpture and architecture. When actually, what about quilting? What about textiles? What about pottery? What about gesso paneling? All these mediums are so worthy of being celebrated as high art, or whatever that means. And so I think it's really important to break down that canon. Also, when we're looking at a global art history, painting, sculpture and architecture aren't necessarily, considered high art. So for example, let's look at 19th century America. Quilt making was completely in abundance. There was an extraordinary artist called Harriet Powers, who was born in 1837 into slavery. And in her later life, she was able to become a quilt maker. And the fact that this woman overcame so many barriers in her life, and 2 of her works remain. They're called Biblical Quilt. And what she does is she kind of pieces together these beautiful sort of stencil cutouts. Yet she wasn't recognized by this establishment until the 1970s, 70 years after her death. The fact that these women just had to overcome so much. And also, it's also about breaking down the canon globally as well, but also how we tell the story of art. Because when I would also read academic texts of art history, they can be quite dense. And art history is also a subject that has so often been seen as elitist. What is this kind of mystical thing that is art? And actually what's so important is that I want everyone to feel like that they could be part of this story. And so I also wrote this book in a very sort of accessible way that, I really think that no one who's ever even stepped inside a museum can read it. It's about inviting everyone into that. And also, if we're not seeing art by a wide range of people, then we're not seeing society as a whole. And the whole point of art history is to tell this visual history of the world, and it's rich, and it's diverse, and it's dense, and it's brilliant. And so we're essentially, what we've done in the past is celebrating this very narrow part of society. So I'm trying to open that up.
Just a small task to get through. And just before we go in and talk about some of these women artists you've written about and their kind of lives and work, can we just briefly focus on something you talk on in the book about, which is about misattribution? Because, lots of people who, like me, read history or anything, are probably pretty used to some older books by men that will say at the beginning, "I'm so grateful to my wife for typing this manuscript," at which point you read, "writing half this manuscript." So is there something similar happening in the history of art?
Absolutely. And really, it all has come out in the last century. For example, in 1917, the Metropolitan Museum of Art bought a work that they thought was by Jacques-Louis David, the kind of leader of neoclassicism, for a staggering $200,000. And in the 70s, they realized it was actually by a woman artist called Marie Charpentier. And, it's the fact that actually in the 50s, when art historians were commenting on its sort of just absolutely sort of divine essence, they then changed their mind and said, actually, this actually isn't of the high caliber that David would paint. Of course it's by a woman. And actually that's completely barbaric, that we're sort of basing art and merit on gender, because at the end of the day, it's a fantastic picture. And the same happened to Frans Hals and Judith Leyster, a fantastic artist working in the Dutch Golden Age, because, you mentioned the wife typing up her husband's manuscript. So much of the time, after a woman artist was married off to her husband, a lot of the time an artist himself, she was actually in his studio painting, and as a result he would then pass off his works as hers. So someone like Judith Leyster, who made these beautiful paintings in the 1620s and only had a very short career because she had to be married off with 5 kids immediately, her name is just coming to light. And actually, in order to get around this kind of problem of misattribution, there are countless examples in the history of art of work by women that actually, when you look at a still life platter, perhaps kind of all these fruits and goblets sort of laid out on a delectable platter, look closely at some of the goblets, and you will see hidden self-portraits within this. So there's a fantastic artist called Clara Peters working in the 17th century. And I love the fact that it's almost her saying, you cannot take this work as yours. It is mine. It's these people who are demanding their place in art history. And I think that's why also, the question of self-portraits and signing as well, it's so important that, people as overlooked, underappreciated communities in the world, they make their mark in the world, and they make that voice heard.
Well, I think self-portraiture actually, yes, absolutely deserving of some applause. Self-portrait, now this is one of the bits of the book where I really did have one of those moments where your jaw just drops and you think, oh, okay, hold on, I need to rethink how I think about this. And a short quote from John Berger, a very famous artist and critic, sadly no longer with us, but I mean, he wrote brilliantly about the sort of gendering of art, and very sympathetically. So a short quote from him, which kind of kicks this off, is, "Men survey women before treating them. Consequently, how a woman appears to a man can determine how she will be treated. To acquire some control over this process, women must contain it and interiorize it. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at." So you come out of this and talk about self-portraiture. So self-portraiture is something quite radical for a woman, isn't it?
Totally. And, you know, to sort of paraphrase that, it's essentially men act and women appear. And as much as I am a complete Bergerite, the quote you're referencing is from a fantastic book called Ways of Seeing. But even John Berger in 1972, who I love with all my heart, even he actually failed to include or reference a single artwork by a woman. So actually, even his work, we're not seeing the full picture. And actually, if he had included some self-portraits by women, he would have found some radical work. So, for example, in 1555, there was an extraordinary Italian artist called Sophonisba Anguissola. And in 1555, she painted her teacher dictating her appearance. So what we see, we first think it's her teacher, you know, painting her, but it's actually her dictating his appearance, dictating her. And she is painted 1.5 times as big as him. She's got him painting the embellishment of the jacket, which is something normally assigned to an apprentice. So what this woman is doing in 1555 is she's actually switching up gender conventions, which is radical. And if John Berger had included that, you know, we would know so much more, because also it's about, you know, so much of this as well is about the narrative of how we've told art history. And actually, we've looked at this such narrow path, and we need to open that up, because history of art has been told time and time and time again by white men. And actually, we need to have different perspectives. And, I say in the introduction to this book as well, I don't say that this is the definitive art history. It's just the history of art that I've grown up with and I've learned in my, not very long life. And so I want to hear everyone else's version of art history, and I think that's what I want to encourage with it as well.
Well, I mean, that is the perfect jumping off point, that, you're absolutely right that it's not just the history of art by men, but by white men and by white elite men. And here we are, sitting in the incredible India. I mean, let's talk a little bit about Indian women artists. I mean, there are so many we could talk about. We could talk about Arpita Singh, we could talk about Bharti Kher, talk about Nazreen Mohammadi, Sunyara Devi. But the one that I would love you to tell us about, because her story is so extraordinary, is the astonishing Amrita Shergill.
Yeah, so Amrita Shergill was absolutely incredible. She was born in 1913 in Hungary. And she was extraordinary. As a teenager, she worked in Paris, and because she was Indian herself, what she did was she kind of merged these cultures in her art. And so in the sort of early 20s, she painted in such expressive way. Again, she painted self-portraits. She immortalized the Indian woman in Paris. She was the first Indian artist to attend the École des Beaux-Arts, which is an extraordinary feat, when she was a teenager. And, but then as she was studying in Paris, she said, she had this sort of haunting idea that she had to go back to India. She said, I can only paint in India. Europe belongs to Matisse, Picasso, and Braque. India belongs to me. She wanted to paint in her country, and as a result, what she did, she went out into the mountains, and she painted people for who they were. Again, she didn't discriminate. She wanted to even kind of bring to life communities who were living in smaller villages, and her works just exude this sort of electricism in it. They exude electricity, and also she really kind of focuses on women especially, on that sort of cusp of adolescence. It's such a complex time, and something that is not seen in the story of art by Gombrich. And actually, what is it like to be an 18-year-old, who has lived in Italy, in Hungary, in Paris, and then has come back to India? And she was earning great success in her mid-20s already, but distraughtly, when she was 28 years old, she died very suddenly. But she left behind this extraordinary body of work. And I think that's the thing. What these women did was just totally fearless. They immortalized their story and said, this is what deserves to be heard.
I mean, and it is magical. I mean, please go and look it up. Well, in fact, also buy Katy's book, which is full of the most beautiful pictures. They've actually sold out at the festival, so you're going to have to buy it from Full Circle Books online. But, I mean, it's so terrific to look at these works. I mean, let's talk about some of the kind of unique obstacles that women artists face? Because, I mean, as you say, for instance, being denied access to life drawing classes or anything, you know, does change how you approach art. It does mean that you actually are, you know, not having the full range of expertise. But the story in your book, which just, again, absolutely floored me, was, of course, about Artemisia Gentileschi. So she was an artist in the Renaissance, actually one of the finest artists in the Renaissance. But, you know, this is going to be distressing, but something happened to her in 1611, which, you know, really had a huge impact on her life. You know, can you tell us about this?
Absolutely. I mean, Artemisia Gentileschi was also a rare case because she is known for these kind of towering, grand paintings that are just so visceral and bloody. She was working at the cusp of the 1600s, you know, in this sort of Baroque era, which exudes this sort of theatricalism as well. And she was born in 1593, and so much of the time, if a woman artist for a woman to become an artist, she actually needed a powerful man looking after her. And actually, you know, let's hear it for the dads, and you know, because Artemisia's father, Orazio Gentileschi, was an incredible artist, and he let her experiment in his studio. And as a result, if she wasn't able to go to the Life Room or go to the cathedral unchaperoned, where you'd see the most grandest paintings of the day, she was able to see them inside his studio. And she grew up grinding pigments. But of course, this was the cusp of the 17th century in Rome, and it wasn't a kind place to women. And already aged 17, she painted a picture called Susanna and the Elders. And in the West, Susanna and the Elders is this very famous story of a sort of young, virtuous woman who's bathing in her garden when two lecherous men come over and try and seduce her. And the reason why it's popular in especially European museums is because it allows for a semi-naked Susanna, essentially pornography for men. And what she did is she actually painted it from her point of view. It's a distressing painting, it's towering, it's brilliant though, because she gives voice to what it must have been like to be a teenager in 1610 in Rome. And a year later, when she was in the studio of her father, she was raped by a friend of her artist father called Agostino Tassi. And, you know, her father didn't immediately report it. And actually the only reason why he reported it in the end is because it brought distress on him and his own family. He wasn't looking out for her. And as a result, it resulted in an excruciating 7-month trial where she was tortured with a sort of instrument called a sibylle, which is ropes tied around her fingers and tightened. I mean, the most abhorrent punishment.
And can we just clarify? Yeah. She was tortured.
Yeah.
Not the accused rapist, but her, the victim, was tortured. Can you explain why, at least, to this audience who I'm sure are thinking, what the hell?
I mean, I'm thinking the same thing, and also to sort of ruin an artist's hand is to ruin their career. Anyway, for some reason, she overcame it and the next year moved to Florence and spent the rest of her career. I mean, she, you know, was called by Charles I to come to England in 1630. And what she did, she immortalized these biblical heroines, Judiths, Lucretias, Susannas, but she gave them the power. Because if you compare, for example, there's this fantastic work that I urge you all to look up called Judith Beheading Holofernes. And oftentimes in art history, Judith is kind of looking a bit passive. So in Caravaggio, although Holofernes is getting his last breaths of life, you know, he still looks mighty. And in Artemisia's, what she does, she actually switches up the story. So Judith and her maidservant, who was in the original story, was keeping watch. Actually, they're butchering this guy's head like a piece of meat. And it's this towering work, and she painted it twice. And, you know, when she also, the topic of self-portraits, she immortalized herself as St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was a saint who was rescued by divine intervention. And this was a woman who is now considered an absolute feminist icon. But how many of you have heard of her? You know, it's the fact that we need these stories to be globally recognized, because the fact that she was doing this in the early 1600s is such a feat, and personally, you know, I look to her every day.
Absolutely. And I mean, while of course we know that, you know, male artists may well have had to themselves deal with things like sexual assault, for a woman this did represent something quite different, didn't it? I mean, as you say, she had to spend 7 months defending herself. She was tortured to confirm that she was telling the truth. That was how what they thought they were doing. I mean, these are sort of obstacles in life that male artists were not really having to deal with in the same way at all.
No, not at all. And also, you know, this idea of class as well, which is still a huge issue in, you know, the art world, especially where I live in London, where rents are so high. You know, it's very much, you know, looking at only a certain artist from a certain class can really actually become an artist. And also when we're looking at obstacles as well, the reason why perhaps women aren't, they're not recognized with these grand sort of multi-figured paintings, although Artemisia Gentileschi was, is because they were very much reduced or restricted to sort of lower genres of art, portraits or still life. But as I said, with Sophonisba Anguissola or Clara Peters, they monopolized these markets and switched them up. For example, another one, Sophonisba Anguissola, immortalized her and her sisters playing a game of chess, first of all, showing women's intellectualism, but behind them is this incredible mountainous landscape. Or, if they're painting a self-portrait, they've got them also painting a full-length portrait here. So they're constantly coming up with clever and witty ways to say, this is my painting and this should be recognized.
There are so many pictures in this book and stories in this book that stop me in my tracks, but one of them is by this extraordinary early artist called Fede Galizia. And it's this miniature. Could you tell us a little about this and how this came about? Because it is so unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, so this work is called Prince Zaga Christ by Fede Galizia. And what it is, it's actually the first miniature in art history of an African man. And it's of this amazing guy called Prince Zaga Christ, who's essentially
very handsome in his picture.
And he's on his way from Ethiopia to Europe. And, you can see the kind of friendship between them because on the back of it, they've got some Amharic inscriptions. And I think that's also, these works have been dismissed for so long, yet they carry with them so many stories. And it's full of richness and everything. And another example of a fantastic artist who has also been completely forgotten, who I only discovered recently, is someone called Edmonia Lewis. And she was an artist working in this sort of neoclassical era in the 19th century, a bit later in America. But she made these grand sort of marble busts and full-length statues in a sort of style of neoclassicism. And she was the first African-American sculptor of any gender to achieve extraordinary success. But what she did is she switched it up because these women seem to have just wanted to show a different side of art history. So she's got this fantastic work called Forever Free that she made 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And what she did is she sculpts these two figures who are these freed slaves, absolutely beautiful. And the woman is knelt on the floor and the man is holding up his fist. And actually what she's doing is she's putting her own narrative into this very historic and, imbued with a lot of, neoclassicism has a lot of problems with it. And so it's about sort of telling their story in the form of a classical representation.
Absolutely, and globally as well. You bring in so many examples, but I was very much taken with some of the Japanese art stories, particularly Katsushika Oi. Am I pronouncing that even slightly correct? Okay, good. Apologies to any Japanese people present for my terrible pronunciation. These women were painting. Her paintings are heart-rendingly beautiful. Can you tell us a little about them?
Totally. So, like I said earlier, so much of the time, women, to become artists, had to be the daughters of artists. And what's extraordinary about Katsushika Oi is if I tell you who her father is, I'm sure many of you will know, Hokusai, who created the Great Wave of Kanagawa. And what she did is she, very much worked in the style of him. Again, she was raised growing up in his studio and actually was his assistant for most of his later career. So it's actually, we talk about how much the wife types up the man's letter or novel or whatever. She was helping him, yet her name went into oblivion after he died. And the only way that I even found out about her was because she had this kind of secret recipe that was to kind of bring out these colors in these such electric ways, because she was kind of footnoted in the British Museum catalogue of Hokusai's a few years ago. And I was like, this is incredible. She kept this secret recipe of keeping colors underground so they would be so bright. And what she did also is she painted in this very sort of traditional way in the sort of 1850s. But it's also as though she's got this extraordinary work, which is called Cherry Blossoms at Night, which is illuminately lit. It's of a woman sort of penning a poem or writing a diary. And she's surrounded by this cherry blossom, and it's in the middle of the night as well. And what it sort of reminds me of Virginia Woolf's, A Room of One's Own. And the fact that these women almost had to perform these things in secret. They had to go and work, and they had to hide while they work, because it was almost as though because they wouldn't be accepted by the establishment or know that they could. And as a result, for me personally, when I look at the works in these books, they become more experimental than ever. And I think there is something to be said about sort of working in secret, however awful and damning it is, the fact that they could just experiment in every way possible.
And talking of innovation, I mean, this is also part of the story, isn't it? That so if you have something like painting, which is very bound up in a canon, you know, and the men are denying entry, the women can't come to life classes, they can't do all of this. When new forms of art emerge, sometimes that gives them an opportunity. And I was very interested in your book in photography in this way, because photography was, you know, low valued. Women were allowed to make inroads early on, weren't they? And I mean, there's some amazing early photography by women.
Exactly. One of the earliest photographers is Julia Margaret Cameron, who was kind of working alongside the pre-Raphaelites. And I think photography for women, you know, something that really was pioneered at the end of the 19th century. It didn't have this patriarchal history that painting and sculpture had. So really, women were invited to it. And as a result, you know, they went out in the streets with their handheld camera in the early 20th century. You know, they reported on the front line like Lee Miller in the 1940s in World War II. But I think that's also something that I wanted to really sort of get to grips with in this book, is that, you know, we've heard of photography, sculpture, printmaking, or we've heard of big movements like Impressionism or Abstract Expressionism, or what is minimalist art? What does it actually mean? And part of this book was also kind of taking these buzzwords and saying to people, let's actually really decode them and write them in an accessible way, and let's root them in these different subjects in order to sort of bring them to life. Like, what is the history of photography, and how has it developed in art history?
And actually, that's something you sort of bring up, isn't it? That really what modern art means, what it is. Well, why don't you tell us? What is modern art, Katy?
So, you know, I really argue in the book that what makes art modern is actually the participation of women artists. And the word modern art is often seen, you know, at the sort of cusp of the 20th century. So kind of 1880s or 1850s, you know, up until the sort of early 20th century. And the reason for that is, for the first time, like I said, women could be admitted to the life room, but they could also wander around the streets of Paris unchaperoned, which meant they could look at works in the Louvre. They could spend their time studying the marble sculptures and the plaster casts. And actually, it's up to them. For some, you know, for the first time ever, they weren't restricted by anything. They had freedoms, you know, some freedoms and some liberations. And of course, in the early 20th century, women get the vote. You know, so much changes. And as a result, they're inserting themselves into art history like never before. And suddenly, they're painting everything from their point of view. So there's a fantastic Impressionist artist called Berthe Morisot. And, you know, she was working in the kind of 1870s and 1880s, just before the sort of cusp of this freedom. But she paints the complexity of motherhood. You know, how often do we see that represented by male artists? It's the fact that they are grappling with these subjects that have so often been dismissed by the canon, by the establishment, and they're saying, actually, no, these things matter. Motherhood matters. It's not all gorgeous virgin and childs. It's complex. So, for example, she paints her sister Edma in this work called The Cradle, which is extraordinary. And it's Edma who's dressed in a kind of striped blazer and these kind of ruffles, something that I would quite like to wear today. And she's clearly a modern woman, but Edma, because of marriage, had to give up her artistic career. And so it's also this really complicated painting of her looking down at her baby, who's kind of shielded with this beautiful sort of white net. And it's sort of saying, you know, do I stay in and look after you, or do I go out and see the world? And actually, these questions are still something that we're grappling with today as women across the world. These are global stories that need to be addressed and recognized. And also, I think the power of figurative painting as well is the fact that we can see who lived and who came before us. Like I mentioned, Amrita Shergill. And there was also this extraordinary artist called Alice Neal, who really was, the influence behind this book as well, because I saw her work at a very similar age that I started The Great Women Artists. And only she has sort of just come to light. She was born in 1900 in America, and she died in 1984. And she only really got some recognition in her 70s. And she was a portrait artist known for painting pictures of people from all different walks of life in New York City. You know, she painted those in drag. She painted her landlord's son. She painted Andy Warhol after he'd been shot. But she painted with such truth, and she painted people from all different aspects of society, of all ages and races, and she didn't discriminate. And I think that's the power of portraiture, of figurative painting, is that we actually see people who came before us. And actually, a fantastic American critic called Hilton Als writes fantastically on Alice Neal, because he talks about seeing her painting for the first time as a young black queer boy in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and seeing his story immortalized in paint. And I just think that, I think all of us will probably find something, one work that sort of resonates in this book. And it can just be just one, that's the kind of power of it. And it will speak to us. And I think, that's also why I wrote it in this kind of very accessible way, is because I want a sort of 13-year-old to pick it up in a library at their school or something and just see their story told and feel like they can also go out there and be an artist and be part of art history. And also I should mention that, so many of these women as well, they were such sort of humble, yes, brilliantly bohemian, eccentric people, but they were also fantastic educators as well. And so much of the time, for example, an extraordinary artist called Ruth Asawa, working in the mid-20th century, who was of Japanese descent, she was an American, she was interned when she was a teenager. But as a result, it kind of instilled in her what the teachers in the camps instilled in her, which was this ability and need and just must to teach the younger generations. And she's actually now renowned in San Francisco because she founded this workshop called the Alvarado Arts Workshop. And what she did is she said to all these kids in San Francisco, I'm going to give you baker's clay, essentially flour and water. And what she did is she got them to make these ceramics. And the power of arts education and what that can do, the power of showing someone that they can be part of something, or they can make something, or, that can instill children to do anything. The arts are so important because you can go in any sorts of skills.
Right, now, I really want to come to the audience for questions. I'm sure there are going to be questions. So yes, stick your hands up. There's one lady down here, please. If you just wait for the microphones are just coming. We'll come to you first.
Hi, thank you. If I could just preface my question with a small acknowledgement that it is a bit bizarre when we're talking about who writes art history to have two white women sit on stage and talk about Amrita Shergill, when I don't think that anybody who engages with Indian art can do so without having known and engaged with Amrita. And I would welcome you to sit in that discomfort with me. My question to you, could you please contextualize your work with other movements and organizations like the Guerrilla Girls and the work that they're doing?
Absolutely, it's a great question. So the Guerrilla Girls, for those who aren't familiar with them, are these fantastic artist collective who are sort of, they were sort of born in New York in 1985 after some of them went to an exhibition at MoMA called an International Survey of Painting and Sculpture, when they discovered that I think something like 6% of this sort of renowned exhibition was actually made up of women artists. And then what the Guerrilla Girls do is they also work in this brilliantly sort of humorous and sort of tongue-in-cheek way. What they did, they again, to sort of go against the establishment, they went to the streets as their museum. If the establishment wasn't going to accept women artists, and they were going to take it upon themselves to actually work throughout the night and paste posters up on the street with brilliantly humorous slogans. So they said, the disadvantages, the advantages of being a woman artist, which are essentially the disadvantages of being a woman artist. Or do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Because they found that the numbers of nude women completely outnumbered the amount of women who were actually telling their story or who they were painters. And they are a complete inspiration to me. They are a fantastic collective. And I think what I love about them is that they're just fearless and they say what they want and they engage with so many different parts of art history, and they also call museums out. And I think it's so important, like you said as well, to check ourselves, to always make sure that we are hearing all different sides of the stories. And they're still working today, and they're just extraordinary.
Okay, more hands up, please. Oh, we've got, okay, so, yes, they are wonderful. We've got down here, please, and then we will take one from the back after that.
Amrita Shergill has a road named after her in New Delhi, an incredibly posh road. I'm wondering what other ways there are to calibrate or celebrate the great women artists. Like, what would you like to see as progress in other areas?
Well, I think there's so much to be done. I think that, I always say nothing happens overnight. I think the fact that you've all come here today shows that you're interested in changing the narrative of the story of art, which is just fantastic. And, hopefully you'll go away today saying, I learned about a new woman artist, or hang on a second, can I even name 5 women artists? Actually, I conducted a survey last year, and I found that only 30% of the British public could name more than 3 women artists, which is shocking. But the thing is that actually the fact that we're just learning about this subject is just a small, is a step. And, you know, like I did the Instagram account, I always say, you know, use whatever resources you have. But of course, you know, I think also the most important thing for me is also children as well, and letting them know that these stories exist. And the fact that Amrita Sher has a road named after her, that means all these kids in New Delhi are going to say, you know, actually, who is this person? Maybe they're going to look her up and she's always going to be a name in their head, you know, as a road name. And I think we can just do whatever we can in our capacity. It's about word of mouth. And then it's about, you know, honouring people. You know, in England, we have the blue plaque system, and that's great because it's out in the public. Or perhaps we might buy a book. Perhaps we might buy an artwork specifically by a woman artist. I think we have to sort of go out of our way when the statistics are so shocking. You know, the fact that if the National Gallery are not going to have more than 1% of their collection by women, I think we have to then go out on our own and do that work and actually protest them as well. Do work like the Guerrilla Girls are doing and actually say to these establishments, you need to change the narrative now because otherwise people aren't going to feel included in this story.
Okay, we've got, oh, lots of hands up all of a sudden. Okay, could we please have the gentleman in the yellow sweater just here, yes?
Hi. So I am interested in, you know, pioneers of electronic music like Wendy Carlos. She was involved with Bob Moog in making the first synthesizer, and there are many such electronic musicians, you know, female electronic musicians that were just that are just unknown now. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it applies to so many different sort of genres as well, not just with electronic music, but it's also, you know, I think of classical music or literature or anything. You know, what I really want this book to do is for people to say, okay, you know, this is my specialist area. So yours might be music. What type of music? Okay, let's question ourselves. I want someone to write the story of literature without men. I want people to write the story of film without men. I mean, could I name more than 3 composers who are women? Could I name more than 10 directors who are women? You know, it's the fact that we need to sort of constantly check ourselves, and you know, I think it applies to all different spaces in the world.
Okay. So hold on, we've got someone waving at the back in a blue top. Could we go to the back over there?
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. I'm from Japan, by the way. And,
sorry about my pronunciation earlier then.
No, it's good, it's good. But the amazing thing is that if it wasn't you writing the book, would somebody else have written it, in a sense, because you've done such a great justice for women. But I'm just saying, if you hadn't done it, then would there have been somebody who would have taken your place? Is it only you? My answer is, it's only you. Congratulations.
It's totally not. I mean, you know, this book is also a result of so many people in history who have, you know, retained the story of Artemisia, who have retained the story of Katsushika Oi. I am standing on the shoulders of hundreds and thousands of people, and I'm not an academic myself, and the amount of especially women academics who are willing to check this book, speak with me for hours on the phone. I mean, it's a complete collaborative effort. So, you know, it's the fact that so many amazing women have written sort of styles of art history. For example, a fantastic scholar in England called Griselda Pollock has written a book called Old Mistresses. Whitney Chadwick in New York. Linda Nochlin, who penned the essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? I think my approach, you know, I began my art historical career on Instagram, and I write in this sort of particular way that I hope is conversational and invites everyone. And so, I mean, it's shocking to me that no one did this before, but you know, it's 2023, and we can only move forward, and progress can only get better. You know, it's the fact that, for example, you know, where are we now in this moment in 2023? Yes, the statistics are shocking, but more than ever, people are questioning these overlooked stories. And the fact that in America, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, in 2020, they dedicated a year of collecting just women artists. And so I think we are moving in the right direction, and I hope it inspires lots more people to write the same thing.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. So there's a hand up in the middle here. Lady, I think in a blue top. If someone could, microphone's just coming.
Thank you so much, Katy. Thank you for this talk. I'm so honored that we can hear this at the Jaipur Literature Festival. I'm an art educator myself. I don't know if this is a question or this is a statement, and I hope you can do something about this. We need more women at the leadership roles. We need more women who can mentor young artists. Apart from writing books and having art historians comment on works of art, don't you think that it's also important that the way we teach art changes? When I was in London, I did my MA there, and I saw a wonderful retrospective show by Louis Bourgeois at the Tate Modern. And that was the first time that I understood the power of sewing, the power of combining multimedia like glass objects with fabric and textile. So don't you think that the pedagogy of art education needs to change worldwide, because there's not much funding, there's not many mentorship programs, and I feel that till the time that does not change, not much is going to happen at the practical level. We're only going to be remembering Amrita Shergill. We need more women artists coming at the forefront.
Absolutely, and you raise a really fantastic point there. For example, that Louise Bourgeois show, I saw it as well, and it was curated by someone called Frances Morris, who's an extraordinary woman and was the first ever female director of Tate Modern. And that happened in 2017, and actually it was this kind of amazing moment because a woman suddenly took the helm of a museum. But that was only, 6 years ago, which is shocking. But it's the fact that in that 6 years, we have seen women become the directors of the Tate overall, Maria Balshaw, the Louvre, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And I totally agree with you. It's about having those people in powerful positions. It's not just having women as artists, women as writers. It's about having women as leaders and in those curatorial places, because like you said, to understand the power of glassware and sewing and textiles, we actually need to have that other perspective, because we're going into museums to learn. And, even I, as an art historian, I go to the Tate Modern the whole time to discover something new. And actually, when we have people from a global perspective of different genders, we need that in our museums so we can teach the next generation that all this is worthy and also all this is happening around us.
Okay, we've probably got one or two more. Stick your hands right up. Which one?
The green scarf.
Green scarf? Who's got a green? There we go. Brilliant.
Hi, Katy. Thank you. You touched on this a little bit earlier. Just now, you were telling us about how your voice is conversational and it's inviting us in, and you want to invite everyone into this story. I read in an interview that an early draft of your work didn't have so much of the first person in it, and I almost can't imagine your work without it. And so if you could speak a little bit on what was the process of inserting that into that voice into your work, and what did that mean for you?
It's a really wonderful question. I mean, I'm constantly taught by so many writers about using your own voice. I think I interviewed Deborah Levy for my podcast, who's one of my all-time heroes, and she said it's so important to immortalize your voice and to say what you think as well. And I actually remember one of my first drafts of my book, I was so scared about writing a book. How the hell do you write a book? I don't know. I was kind of 26 when I wrote most of this book, and I was so scared about putting my own voice in, although it's kind of easy on Instagram because it's sort of, it's sort of disposable and you can just kind of put it out there. But a book is so different, and I kind of wrote this book for the first draft. It was almost quite sort of formulaic because I just thought, my voice doesn't matter. And my editor said to me that one of the best things, she was like, it's just missing this. Go away and just say what you think. And actually, at the end of the day, like I say, this is my version of a story of art. So, I want to say what I think. And I think that's also so important for us all to remember. We should all have our stories heard, no matter who we are, and to insert ourselves. It's a bit like, the self-portrait question. How did you see the world? That's so fascinating. Say your perspective. And if this can inspire anyone else to do that, then that's my job done, really. But always have your voice heard.
Well, I think it's all of our, yes, so applause that. It's all of our jobs done, because, I had 100 more questions. I'm sure there were more in the audience, but we've nearly reached the end. Katy Hessel, The Story of Art Without Men, thank you so much. As I say, I'm very sorry that it's actually sold out here in the bookshop, but you can certainly order it online. I very thoroughly recommend this book. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Alex.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a huge round of applause to Katy Hessel and Alex von Tunzelman.